are the indigenous peoples in the 54 countries of Africa dealing with major issues such as climate change, human rights, and poverty. We're going to be focusing upon this today and highlighting the role that the indigenous peoples play not only in Africa, but around the world. My guest today is an expert on these topics. My guest today is Mr. Elifuraha Laltaika. Mr. Laltaika of the United Republic of Tanzania is Executive Director of the Association for Law and Advocacy for Pastoralists. He is also a law lecturer at Tumaini University in Makumira. Elifuraha recently joined as an expert member of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues for Africa. Elifuraha, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you, Bill.
You've got quite a geographical area to cover, my friend.
Absolutely.
54 countries.
Absolutely.
But I'm sure you'll do it, no problem.
Yes.
Well, welcome to the program.
Let's
talk a little bit. We're going to get into the situation in Africa. We're going to be talking about these issues. But I'm curious about, when I did the introduction, I was thinking about, you're the Executive Director of the Association for Law and Advocacy for Pastoralists.
Yes.
Just briefly, what is that organization?
This is a non-government organization. It's an NGO dealing specifically with the rights of pastoralists, and the pastoralist means traditional cattle headers, and we work also with the hunter-gatherers. So it's a national NGO with headquarters in Arusha, that is the northern part of Tanzania, and pretty much we deal with laws that affect pastoralists. When they are enacted by Parliament, we make sure we provide our comments on how they can better serve pastoralists and not undermine their rights. And we work also, as I said, with hunter-gatherers. These are communities that whose livelihoods really depends on hunting and gathering fruits. They live traditional lives, and most often because of some misunderstanding of their livelihoods, laws and policies may affect them. So one of our work as a LAPA is to really look at the laws and advise policymakers as well as legislators on how the laws enacted can better serve the traditional communities.
I see. Now, just roughly, not exactly, but approximately how many people are we talking about within your country? Just what percentage of the population or number-wise we fall into this pastoralist, herd gatherers category?
With the hunter-gatherers, they are really a minority. Last census approximates them to be less than 2,000 in a population of 45 million. Pastoralists can go roughly to 300,000. So the Maasai, and there are a lot of other smaller groups. So roughly would say hunter-gatherers as well as pastoralists are less than 10% of the whole population. Yes.
Right. Now you're attending the Indigenous Forum Conference in New York this week, and we're going to get into that in a minute. But when I think of indigenous peoples, I think of the Maoris in New Zealand, I think of the Aborigines in Australia, the Native Americans in North America perhaps, but usually I think of the people who were there first. They were originally on a geographical, physical piece of land. How do you define, how would you define folks who are indigenous peoples?
Yes, a brilliant question. In fact, that was the same concern when issues of indigenous peoples' rights surfaced the African continent for the first time in the 80s. That was the sentiment that how are you talking of aboriginality? We are all indigenous to the continent. But luckily for us, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, this is a body that operates in the continent to make sure that countries adhere to human rights standards. So it conducted a study and to find out how this rubric, which as you said correctly is associated with settler countries like the United States, like Australia, like New Zealand, like Canada, how does it apply to Africa? And that study was conducted and came to a conclusion that in fact there are populations, there are communities in Africa that are at the same position, disadvantaged position like communities that claim indigeneity, indigenous identity in other parts of the world. So the African Commission concluded that issues of aboriginality, or who was the first in the land, do not apply in Africa. What defines indigenous people is marginality, the level of exclusion that persisted attainment of independence. And the report that was adopted by the African Union, the intergovernmental organization for the continent, specified which communities are indigenous people. And luckily also international human rights law doesn't provide for a definition, because a definition is thought as a mechanism where exclusion may be perpetuated. So definitions is considered as undesirable. We know indigenous people by their defining characteristics, which actually also include self-identification. So it is upon a community to self-identify as indigenous to be in line with the international human rights law.
Now, as we mentioned earlier, there are 54 countries in Africa.
Yes.
Do you have an approximate idea of how, I mean, there are literally millions, tens of millions of people who would fall into this indigenous peoples category, but do you have an idea roughly of how many groups we're talking about of indigenous peoples within those 54 countries? Is there a ballpark figure that's out there by any chance?
In fact, we know them by their livelihoods. The African Commission, the report that I talked about, has outlined that communities that fall within the rubric of indigeneity as provided for under international law are hunter-gatherers, traditional hunter-gatherers, some groups of pastoralists, not all of them, as well as fisher folks. And they are marginal in every country. So there's no figure, because not every community has self-identified. But if I talk about my home country, for example, we have the Maasai, we have the Hadzabe, who are hunter-gatherers, we have the Akie, other people call them the Ndorobo hunter-gatherers, living around Kiteto and the district in the Manyara region, and so on and so forth. So we have no exact number as yet, because no census has been made across the continent, but they cover those livelihoods that are considered by governments as anti-development, as backward, and therefore a lot of laws and policies are made undermining them, including by taking the land that rightfully belongs to them.
This seems to be a problem in just about every, I won't say every country of the world, but a large number of the countries where you have indigenous peoples, that there's been an encroachment upon their land. We've seen it in the United States, we've seen it in Brazil, we've seen it in many other countries where mining companies, agricultural entities, what have you, loggers, whatever, want to move into these areas. This is pretty much endemic throughout most of the African countries, is that correct?
Exactly. It's really, really problematic in Africa, especially because we are currently also keeping pace with development as defined broadly in the neoliberal way. You see, we want to have a lot of industries, we have roads, we need dams, we need to generate electricity, we need to license our lands for extraction of minerals and oil and gas, and that doesn't translate very well with the traditional livelihood, because you are seen as blocking the vision of development. So I would say pretty much in the whole continent that is a problem. And apart from development, which means extraction of resources, there's also a problem of wildlife conservation. It's seen as a justification for evicting traditional occupiers, instead of promoting the idea of using pastoralists and the hunter-gatherers to really, as a custodians of the land. They are seen as a problem, and that need for conservation is used to justify their evictions from their land. So the problem is growing as time goes.
Now, you're the expert on the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues for Africa.
Yeah.
How will you, and that's from 2017 to 2020 or 2019?
2019.
2019.
3 years, yes.
Yes, and
Yes.
how will you use that forum to promote a discussion of these issues and these challenges and problems confronting indigenous peoples within the second largest continent, I believe? Africa is the
Yes.
second largest population behind Asia,
Yes.
a gigantic area, but how will you promote those issues?
Brilliant question. In fact, we start by looking at the mandate of the UN Permanent Forum, which is actually to advise the UN system as a whole, including agencies and programs, including the World Bank. And you can agree with me that a lot of development in Africa is financed through some UN programs and the agencies, including the World Bank. And therefore, my role is to make sure the recommendations that we generate as a forum are in line with the realities in the African continent with regards to the livelihoods of pastoralists and the hunter-gatherers, because we don't want development, however defined, to be used as a justification to really destroy their livelihood and kill them and pollute their environment and water and forest. So all recommendations that we make, and as the representative of Africa in the expert body, I think I look at the recommendations that we make with the prism of an African scholar and see how when they are implemented by agencies and programs, they do not do harm to indigenous livelihoods in the continent.
That's very extremely important to do that.
Thank
Now,
you.
will you be talking, are there certain areas where climate change, I'm sure, is affecting every country in Africa, every country in the world is being, it seems like, adversely affected in some way, shape, or form. But will you be traveling around to develop conferences? Will you be working with other non-governmental organizations, other governmental organizations to set up conferences to focus attention on these issues? How will you do that? It's a large area to cover and very important issues, and some are similar, but some are different in the different countries and different areas.
Absolutely, I totally agree with you. It's a huge continent with a lot of countries and a lot of issues requiring attention as well. As an independent expert, one of the other windows of opportunity is to conduct a study. And this year I've been appointed along with another expert member to conduct a study on the impacts of wildlife conservation to indigenous people. So that's one way of getting views of the whole continent. But we also occasionally have preparatory meetings where we prepare as the African caucus and say what are the issues that we need to take to the United Nations. I am an independent expert representing them, but I don't bring my own independent thoughts and the analysis. I sort of make sure I get their views on how to prioritize, and usually the preparatory meeting provides a very important platform for us to do that.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with any type of media outlet, be it a PBS station, community access television station, or you're involved with a university that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you just have a website and you find the programs interesting and you would like to share them, please do so. Go to the website, our website, download the shows. Global Connections Television is provided free of charge at no cost as a public service to help people better understand international issues and how they impact us no matter where we live. Today we're taking a look at some of the major issues affecting indigenous peoples, and we're covering a large area. We're talking about the continent of Africa and also focusing a bit on Tanzania. And my guest today is an expert on all of these issues. My guest is Mr. Elifuraha Laltaika of the United Republic of Tanzania. He is the Executive Director of the Association for Law and Advocacy for Pastoralists. Elifuraha, we're talking about how you can reach out to the peoples of Africa. What are some of the major issues? We mentioned human rights in passing, climate change, but have you prioritized them? Is climate change the number one issue as far as what's going on, or human rights? Are they up there equal, so to speak? Which are some of the 2 or 3 major issues you're going to be focusing upon?
Number one is really the aspect of participation. You know, Bill, that this time around we are implementing sustainable development goals, and the buzzword is leaving no one behind. And the indigenous peoples in Africa are worried that that may not translate into reality unless we have some specific methodological issues that would ensure they are in the picture, because they are used to historical exclusion. Then nobody cares about them. Projects are formulated in the capitals and then implemented in their lands, and oftentimes they don't really change their lives in any significant way. So that's the main thing we are trying to debate. How can we make sure that hunter-gatherers, pastoralists, small scale fishermen and farmers would matter, would be brought at the center of implementation of various projects that are meant to really sustainably change their lives. But another is the aspect of lands, territories and resources. We are seeing that their lands is shrinking very, very fastly because of a lot of misconceptions on their livelihoods. You can see, for example, pastoralists, they are discouraged from moving from one place to the other. That is called nomadism, and for them, they move in order to make sure that land is not degraded. So the aspect of moving from one place to the other, not because they want, but one, because resources are not available in one place, so they have to move. So if regulations are made to curtail that mobility, it means the land that is available is in a small scale is degraded, and they cannot get out of diseases that are detrimental to their livestock, so poverty becomes very high. So we are talking of all these issues and try to contextualize and see the big global picture and say, but what does it exactly mean at the level of the community on the ground?
And that's very important. They're doing sustainable farming,
exactly.
And they're doing it the proper way.
Exactly.
Whereas we see that when some of the rainforests are cleared in Indonesia, Brazil, whatever, that so often they're trying to convert them into grassland for cows or cattle or whatever, or perhaps have agricultural farms, but the land gets leached after 2 or 3 or 4 years because of the rains and that type of thing. But they're doing it the right way to preserve the land.
Absolutely, and we oftentimes don't understand that, so we blame them while they're actually doing the right way, which requires promotion. We need to promote it for the betterment of our planet. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Now you're in New York these past 2 weeks for the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. Yes. What is the main purpose of this group, and what are they focusing on this year?
Oh, yes, the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues is composed of experts appointed by the government, and the others appointed on recommendations by Indigenous Peoples Organization. And this year we are looking at a lot of other recommendations that are brought by indigenous people, by states, and by UN agencies. And we compile them into a report containing our various recommendations. And up to now, the 2 weeks, issues of connections to water. I think because of the problems probably here in the US and in other countries, so indigenous peoples have voiced very loudly the issue of connections with water, that they are keepers of water and they need water to be promoted. Another is, as I said, is the issue of the intersection between wildlife conservation and indigenous people's rights. We looked at it and we made some recommendations. Another, as I said, is the issue of sustainable development goals, that indigenous people think we need some methodological approaches that will ensure that they are not left behind. And the issue of representation, they think that because many UN agencies and programs talk about them, it is important that each and every UN agency has a specific platform, you may say a department, dealing with indigenous people's issues. So we listen to a number of indigenous people's delegates, we listen to states, we listen to UN agencies, and recommend and come up with one document containing a number of recommendations that we send to various organs of the United Nations for dissemination.
And if our viewers would like more information on that group, they can go to un.org/indigenous and tap into what they're doing and get the final report as to what your recommendations will be and all of the issues that we're talking about today. Well, before we run out of time, I don't want to ignore Tanzania. We've been talking about Africa in general and your role as an expert. Are there 2 or 3 major issues you'll be dealing with in country in Tanzania that need to be focused on immediately? I know you're talking about participation, democracy building, leaving no one behind, that type of thing. But there are 2 or 3 that you'll be dealing with when you go home?
Yes, we are dealing also with the aspect of climate change because, drought is hitting hard countries in Africa, and Tanzania is not by any way exception, and therefore pastoralists are getting impoverished because a lot of their livestock have died. And also for hunter-gatherers, fruits are not available and animals have migrated away, so poverty has escalated, and so we are talking about it as a very serious challenge. And it also touches also with farmers because drought and prices of food have gone very high. So that's also a very important topic for now. But as usual, we are looking at laws and policies and how they are affecting pastoralists. We are also looking at the new constitution, the prospects for the country to come up with a new constitution, and we are keeping an eye as pastoralists so that we make some gains, we make some advancements. So if at all that constitution will be made, our intention is to make sure that we gain, we are represented, we have our issues covered in the document a little bit more prominently than it is currently.
What do you think will be your biggest challenge as you move forward in your new assignment?
I think it is the coverage, that the geographical coverage, that as an independent expert for the whole of Africa, I think is a huge continent. So that's number one challenge. But with technology and with networks, because indigenous peoples have networks, regional, sub-regional, and national, I think that may be lessening a little bit of the workload. But the moment I was appointed, that was the first reaction that, from South Africa to Morocco, that's a huge landmass.
So what's the problem?
Yes, but I think I received the appointment with humility, and I think I can manage despite that the challenge of geography.
Well, indigenous peoples are 5% of the total population of the world. They occupy they're on 22% of the land around the world, and they live in an area where 80% of the diversity is located. And of course, they are very adversely affected by climate change and many other actions that are directed against them, but they also are playing a vital role in helping to focus on these really pristine resources and sustainable resources that we need to be sure to sustain in the future. But it is so important to do that, and you've got a very interesting assignment coming up, and we're going to look forward to hearing much more about it in the future. But I want to thank you, Elifuraha, for all of the information you've given us today, and I wish you the very best in your future activities. But thank you for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Thank you, sir.
Right, thank you.
I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.